My cousins tried to take over the family business, but I refused to let them walk all over me, and I destroyed them. And then my grandfather Walter started it as a tiny woodworking shop, carving out furniture by hand, selling pieces to neighbors, and building a reputation for craftsmanship. Over decades, it became Walter's Creations, a thriving high-end furniture empire. Walter always talked about how it wasn't just a business. It was a legacy, something all of us would inherit and grow together. For a long time, I believed that. But things started to change after Walter stepped back. He was getting older, and even though he still popped into the office a few days a week, the real decisions were being left to us, the younger generation. I never expected my cousins, Jordan, Cassidy, and Blake, to turn on me, though. Not like this. It started subtly. I'd walk into meetings and find decisions had already been made without me. "Oh, Alex, sorry. We didn't want to bother you with the smaller stuff," Jordan said once, flashing me his rehearsed, innocent smile. At first, I brushed it off. I've never been the type to stir up conflict. But when it kept happening, key meetings, financial updates, marketing campaigns, I started to feel uneasy. One Friday, I overheard Cassidy and Blake talking in hushed tones by the break room. "We just need to get the paperwork finalized," Cassidy said. When they noticed me, they went quiet, plastering on forced smiles. "Oh, hey, Alex," she chirped, a little too brightly. Something was going on. The real tipping point came a few weeks later. Walter had called a family dinner at his house, something he did every month to keep us all close. But that night, the mood was strange. Jordan, Cassidy, and Blake arrived early, laughing and whispering among themselves, acting like they owned the place. My sister, Sophia, noticed it too. "What's up with them?" she muttered as we set the table. Sophia was younger than me, still in college, but she had a sharp eye for tension. "They're acting like they're planning a coup or something." I laughed it off, but it stayed with me. Over dinner, Jordan kept steering the conversation to the future of the business. "Grandpa, you've done an amazing job building the company," he said, voice dripping with charm. "But it's time for us to bring it into the future. Alex is good at the old stuff. Sure, but we need fresh ideas." Walter frowned. "Alex has been working there since he was 16. He knows that business as well as I do." Jordan smiled thinly. "Of course, Grandpa. I'm just saying, we should all have a say in the direction we're taking." Sophia kicked me under the table, her expression screaming, "Watch out." That night, I couldn't sleep. Their behavior was nagging at me. I decided to dig a little deeper, starting with the business records. Since I handled most of the finances, I had access to everything. It didn't take long to find something suspicious. A series of meetings scheduled with a law firm I'd never heard of, booked by Jordan. The next morning, I confronted him in the office. "What's this about? Why are you meeting with lawyers without looping me in?" Jordan didn't even flinch. "Relax, Alex. It's nothing shady. We're just exploring some restructuring options, trying to streamline things." "Streamline?" I echoed. "You mean cutting me out?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You're paranoid. Nobody's cutting you out. But let's be honest, not everyone can be in charge. Someone has to step up and lead." His words hit me like a slap. Walter put all of us in charge. That was his vision. Jordan shrugged. "Visions change." I couldn't ignore it anymore. I needed help, someone I could trust. My best friend Mason had been my sounding board since high school, and he knew the family dynamic well. That night, I called him over, pacing my living room as I laid everything out. "They're trying to push me out," I said, fists clenched. "I know it." Mason leaned back on the couch, his expression serious. "You're not wrong, man, but you need proof. Hard proof. Otherwise, it's just your word against theirs." That was the problem. Jordan was slick, and Cassidy and Blake followed his lead like loyal henchmen. If I confronted them outright, they'd deny everything. I needed a plan. Mason nodded toward my laptop. "Start with their meetings. If they're working with lawyers, there's gotta be a paper trail. Emails, contracts, something." It was a good idea, but I had no idea how deep this rabbit hole went. Over the next week, I started keeping tabs on everything. Marcus, a longtime employee who'd been with the company since Walter's early days, noticed I'd been on edge. "You okay, Alex?" he asked one afternoon. Marcus was the kind of guy who saw everything but said little, a quiet observer. If there was anyone I could trust at the office, it was him. I hesitated, then decided to test the waters. "Have you noticed anything off lately? Like with Jordan, Cassidy, and Blake?" Marcus gave me a knowing look. "They've been meeting a lot behind closed doors. And they've been poking around areas they don't usually touch. Legal, accounting. I don't know what they're up to, but it doesn't feel right." That was all the confirmation I needed. My cousins weren't just trying to sideline me. They were planning something bigger. And if I didn't figure it out soon, I could lose everything. I wasn't about to let that happen. The days after my conversation with Marcus were a blur of frustration and quiet desperation. Every moment I wasn't working, I was digging through company emails, financial records, anything that might show what Jordan, Cassidy, and Blake were up to. But they were careful, too careful. If they were plotting something, they weren't leaving an obvious trail. I needed a break, and it came when Mason called me one evening. "Hey, I might have found something," he said, his voice low like he was afraid someone might overhear. "You know Dylan, right? Jordan's friend from college?" "Yeah," I said, frowning. Dylan was a name I hadn't heard in years, but I remembered him as the type of guy who could charm his way into anyone's circle. He was also notorious for stirring up trouble. "What about him?" "He's been hanging around the company's lawyer," Mason said. "I caught him coming out of a restaurant with Cassidy and some guy in a suit yesterday. It looked like business, not casual." My blood ran cold. "You're sure?" 100%. "I got a picture, just in case." Mason sent me the photo, and sure enough, there was Dylan, sitting across from Cassidy and a man I recognized as one of the attorneys listed in Jordan's mysterious meetings. My stomach churned. Dylan wasn't just hanging around. They were working together. It wasn't long before another piece of the puzzle fell into place. Later that week, a client called me, upset about a recent order delay. Normally, I'd have been the first to know about any supply chain issues, but this was news to me. When I checked the logs, I found a series of last-minute changes to production schedules, changes made by Cassidy. She'd rerouted resources to focus on a project I had no idea existed. I confronted her in the office the next morning. "What's this about?" I asked, holding up the logs. Cassidy looked up from her desk, her expression carefully neutral. "It's just a priority shift, Alex. Nothing to get worked up about." "Priority shift? Without consulting me? We're supposed to make these decisions together." She shrugged. "Jordan thought it was best to move forward quickly. We didn't want to waste time." I slammed the papers down on her desk, my frustration bubbling over. "You didn't want to waste time? Or you didn't want me involved?" Her mask slipped for a fraction of a second, and I saw something cold and calculating in her eyes. "You're overreacting," she said smoothly. "We're just trying to do what's best for the company." That was the moment I realized they weren't just undermining me. They were actively working to push me out. They weren't waiting for me to fail. They were setting me up to look incompetent. And it wasn't just about power. This was personal. I called Mason as soon as I got home. "They're cutting me out of everything," I said, pacing my living room. "Production schedules, client relations, even finances. If I don't stop them, they'll ruin my reputation before I even know what hit me." Mason was quiet for a moment before asking, "What's their endgame? Do you think they're trying to take over completely?" "I don't think," I said. "I know. And they're not doing it alone. Dylan's involved, and who knows who else." Mason sighed. "Then you need to find out exactly what they're planning. If you can prove they're going behind your back, you'll have leverage." That night, I decided to go straight to the source. Jordan had been acting like he owned the place, so it wasn't hard to figure out where he kept his files. I waited until the office was empty, then slipped into his corner office with a sinking feeling in my gut. At first, I didn't find much, just the usual contracts and project proposals. But then I stumbled across a folder labeled Restructure Plans. My hands trembled as I opened it, and what I saw made my blood boil. The folder contained a detailed proposal to shift the company's leadership structure, effectively reducing my role to a figurehead position while Jordan took control as CEO. Cassidy and Blake would each receive significant shares of the company, leaving me with a fraction of the ownership I'd worked so hard to maintain. But that wasn't the worst part. Attached to the proposal was a draft of a letter to Walter, urging him to sign off on the changes. The letter was full of lies about my supposed lack of vision and inability to lead. They were planning to manipulate our grandfather into giving them control, all while making me look like the villain. I took photos of everything, my heart pounding. This wasn't just a power play, it was a full-blown coup, and I wasn't about to let it happen. The next day, I decided it was time to confront them. I waited until we were all in the same room, Jordan, Cassidy, Blake, and me. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady despite the anger boiling under the surface. Jordan raised an eyebrow. "About what?" I pulled out my phone and opened the photos I'd taken. "About this." Cassidy's face went pale, but Jordan recovered quickly. "You've been snooping through my files?" he asked, his tone sharp. "That's a violation of company policy, Alex. Don't turn this around on me," I snapped. "You're the one violating every principle this company was built on. You're trying to cut me out, and you're lying to Grandpa to do it." Blake shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but Jordan didn't back down. "You don't understand what's at stake here," he said. "We're trying to protect the company from your short-sightedness." "Short-sightedness?" I repeated, incredulous. "I've been working here since I was 16. I've put my blood, sweat, and tears into this business. And you're calling me short-sighted?" Cassidy finally spoke up, her voice trembling. "It's not personal, Alex. We just think the company needs a new direction." "Not personal?" I echoed. "You're stealing everything I've worked for and calling it a new direction?" Jordan stood, his expression hard. "If you're not with us, you're against us. And trust me, Alex, you don't want to be against us." I left the room shaking with anger, but I wasn't afraid. If they thought I was just going to roll over and let them take everything, they were dead wrong. The confrontation left me boiling with anger, but also lit a fire under me. Jordan's threat wasn't just bluster. It was a declaration of war. If I didn't act fast, they'd take everything, and Walter might not even realize it until it was too late. I had the photos of the restructure plans, but I needed more to blow their scheme wide open. Thankfully, I wasn't alone. Mason and Marcus were ready to help. That evening, I called Clara. She wasn't a direct family member but had been close to Walter for years, working with him on various projects as a consultant. Clara was sharp, resourceful, and had an uncanny ability to find information. If anyone could help me uncover the full extent of my cousin's plans, it was her. "Alex," she said after I explained everything, her voice calm but firm, "this is worse than I thought. If they've already drafted letters to Walter, they're moving faster than you realize." "I know," I said, pacing. "They've been meeting with lawyers and outsiders. Mason saw Dylan with Cassidy, and I think he's involved too." She was quiet for a moment. "You need to hit them where it hurts." "The board." "The board?" I echoed. "What do you mean?" Clara explained. While Walter had always maintained control of the company, a board of advisors had been established years ago to oversee major decisions. If I could get the board on my side, I'd have a chance to counter Jordan's power grab. "But the board doesn't know about this," I said. "They're in the dark, just like Walter." "Exactly," Clara said. "That's your leverage. If you can show them proof of what Jordan and the others are doing, you can force a meeting and make your case." It was a solid plan, but it wouldn't be easy. The board wasn't just a group of neutral observers. Some of them had ties to my cousins, and others might not want to take sides. Still, it was my best shot. The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. Marcus, with his extensive knowledge of the company's inner workings, helped me comb through financial records and employee logs. We found more evidence of shady behavior, altered contracts, unapproved spending, and even discrepancies in payroll. It was clear that Jordan and Cassidy had been quietly diverting company resources for their own benefit. Meanwhile, Mason kept an eye on Dylan and Brianna, who seemed to be their enforcers on the outside. "Dylan's been making calls to suppliers," Mason reported one evening. "He's trying to renegotiate contracts behind your back." It was like fighting a hydra. Every time I uncovered one scheme, another popped up. But the most alarming discovery came from Marcus. He found a series of emails between Cassidy and an unknown buyer, discussing the sale of a major stake in the company. My heart sank as I read the messages. They weren't just planning to take over. They were preparing to sell off parts of the business. This wasn't about preserving Walter's legacy. It was about lining their pockets. Armed with this new information, I decided it was time to confront Walter. He needed to know what was happening before it was too late. I showed up at his house late one evening, my stomach in knots. Walter greeted me with his usual warmth, but there was a shadow of concern in his eyes. "Alex," he said, ushering me inside. "What's this about? You look like you've seen a ghost." "It's worse than that," I said, handing him the photos and documents I'd collected. "You need to see this." Walter sat down and began reading, his expression growing darker with every page. By the time he finished, he looked furious. "I can't believe this," he said, shaking his head. "Jordan, Cassidy, Blake, they're my own grandchildren. How could they do this?" "They don't care about the legacy," I said. "They care about control. And if we don't stop them, they'll sell off everything you built." Walter leaned back, rubbing his temples. "This is a nightmare. But you've done the right thing, Alex. We need to act quickly." The next morning, Walter called a surprise board meeting. Jordan, Cassidy, and Blake arrived looking smug, clearly thinking they were about to solidify their control. But when they saw Walter and me sitting at the head of the table, their smiles faltered. "Thank you all for coming," Walter began, his voice steady but firm. "I've called this meeting to address some alarming developments." Jordan leaned back in his chair, trying to appear unfazed. "What kind of developments?" Walter gestured to me, and I stood, my hands trembling slightly as I laid out the evidence. I presented the photos, the emails, and the financial records, explaining how my cousins had been conspiring to take over the company and sell off assets. The board members exchanged shocked glances, murmuring among themselves. Cassidy tried to interrupt. "This is a misunderstanding." "No, it's not," I cut her off. "You've been lying to all of us, manipulating Grandpa, and jeopardizing the future of this company. And I have the proof to back it up." Jordan's mask of confidence finally cracked. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" he spat. "This isn't over, Alex." Walter slammed his hand on the table, silencing him. "Yes, it is. I trusted you, all of you, to work together for the good of this family. But you've betrayed that trust." The board voted unanimously to suspend Jordan, Cassidy, and Blake from their roles, pending a full investigation. It was a victory, but I knew the fight wasn't over. My cousins wouldn't go down without a fight. As the meeting ended, Clara pulled me aside. "You did well," she said, "but be careful. They're not done." "I know," I said, "but neither am I." Jordan, Cassidy, and Blake might have been temporarily sidelined, but I knew they wouldn't retreat quietly. They left the boardroom that day seething, and I could almost feel the weight of their glares as they stormed past me. Walter assured me we'd done the right thing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that my cousins were already plotting their next move. If there was one thing I'd learned through all this, it was that they weren't afraid to play dirty. True to form, it didn't take long for them to strike back. The first blow came just 2 days later, when one of our largest suppliers suddenly pulled out of a contract renewal. I only found out because Mason overheard Dylan bragging at a bar about pulling some strings. I barely had time to react before Brianna, one of Cassidy's allies, started spreading rumors among our employees about supposed financial instability in the company. By the end of the week, morale was plummeting, and clients were starting to ask questions. It was a coordinated attack, designed to make me look like I couldn't handle the pressure. But I wasn't going to let them win. While Marcus focused on damage control, Clara helped me gather more evidence. She'd been digging into Dylan and Brianna's connections and uncovered something shocking. Dylan had ties to a rival company. If my cousins were working with him, they weren't just sabotaging me. They were actively undermining the family business. Armed with this information, I decided it was time to hit back. I worked late into the night, poring over contracts and financial records, searching for a way to turn the tide. That's when I found it. A clause in the company's bylaws that allowed for an emergency vote of no confidence if any shareholder was found to be acting against the company's interests. It wasn't just about sidelining them anymore. I could remove their shares entirely. I pitched the idea to Walter the next morning. He was hesitant at first, worried about the fallout, but he eventually agreed. "If they're willing to destroy everything I've built," he said, then they've left us no choice. The next step was convincing the board. It wasn't easy. Some members still had personal loyalties to Jordan, and others were wary of making such a drastic move. But as I laid out the evidence, showing how their actions had already cost us a major contract and put our reputation at risk, the tide began to turn. By the time I finished, most of them were nodding in agreement. That's when the second blow came. Just as the board was about to call for a vote, we received a notice of legal action. Jordan and Cassidy had filed an injunction, claiming the evidence against them was fabricated and accusing me of defamation. It was a blatant stall tactic, but it worked. The vote was delayed, and I suddenly found myself embroiled in a legal battle. Mason, ever the strategist, saw this as an opportunity. If they're going to drag this into court, he said, we can use discovery to dig even deeper into their dealings. They've been careful, but nobody's perfect. If we keep the pressure on, they'll slip. Clara agreed, and with her help, we started building a case of our own. She'd already found more emails linking Dylan to the rival company, and Marcus had uncovered suspicious expense reports tied to a shell corporation. The pieces were starting to come together, but we needed something undeniable, something that would leave no doubt about their intentions. That's when Clara dropped a bombshell. She'd managed to track down an old associate of Dylan's, a disgruntled former employee of the rival company who was willing to talk. According to him, Dylan had been feeding information about our supply chain to his bosses for months, all with Cassidy's approval. Better yet, he had proof. Emails, text messages, even a recording of a meeting where Cassidy and Jordan discussed their plans to undermine the business. It was the smoking gun we needed. With Walter's blessing, I called an emergency board meeting and presented the new evidence. This time, there was no hesitation. The board voted unanimously to strip Jordan, Cassidy, and Blake of their shares and remove them from the company permanently. It was a decisive victory, but it didn't feel like the end. Jordan made that clear when he cornered me in the parking lot after the meeting. "You think you've won?" he said, his voice low and venomous. "This isn't over, Alex. You might have the company, but you'll never have control. We'll make sure of that." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. His threats were empty, and we both knew it. But as I watched him walk away, a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that he had one last card to play. That feeling was confirmed later that night when Clara called me. Her voice urgent. "We've got a problem," she said. "I've been keeping an eye on Dylan, and it looks like he's planning something big. He's been making calls all evening, and I think he's trying to rally support for a hostile takeover." My heart sank. How is that even possible? They don't have the shares anymore. "They don't," Clara said. "But if they can buy enough support from other stakeholders, they might be able to force their way back in." It was a long shot, but it was just crazy enough to work. I knew I couldn't let my guard down. Not yet. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, I felt like I had the upper hand. The days following Clara's call were some of the most intense of my life. With Jordan, Cassidy, and Blake officially removed from their positions and stripped of their shares, the family business was mine to lead. But the threat of a hostile takeover loomed over every decision I made. Dylan and his allies were working fast, spreading rumors and calling in favors to destabilize the company. It was clear they weren't just out for revenge. They wanted to burn the entire legacy to the ground if they couldn't have it. Clara stayed close, digging into Dylan's activities and tracking his movements. "He's desperate," she told me one evening. "He's trying to convince smaller stakeholders to sell their shares, offering them way over market value. If he gets enough of them on board, he could still force a vote." It was a terrifying prospect, but it also gave me an idea. If Dylan and his backers were targeting the smaller stakeholders, I needed to beat them at their own game. I spent the next few days meeting with every stakeholder I could, explaining what was happening and why it was so important to keep the company in family hands. Some were sympathetic, while others were harder to convince, but I didn't back down. Every share I secured was another step toward protecting Walter's legacy. Meanwhile, Marcus uncovered a critical lead. One of Dylan's key allies, a man named Grant who owned a significant chunk of shares, had a history of financial troubles. If I could convince him that siding with Dylan was too risky, it might tip the balance in my favor. With Marcus's help, I arranged a meeting with Grant at a neutral location. The meeting was tense. Grant was guarded at first, clearly wary of being dragged into the middle of the conflict. But as I laid out the evidence of Dylan's underhanded tactics and the damage he'd already caused to the company, I saw his resolve start to waver. "You really think Dylan can pull this off?" Grant asked, his tone skeptical. "I think he'll destroy everything trying," I said. "If you side with him, you're betting against the company, against everything Walter built. Is that a risk you're willing to take?" Grant didn't answer right away, but when he finally spoke, it was clear I'd gotten through to him. "I'll think about it," he said, standing to leave. It wasn't the definitive answer I'd hoped for, but it was a start. That evening, Clara called with another update. "Dylan's making his move," she said. "He's called for an emergency stakeholder meeting tomorrow. If he can rally enough support, he'll push for a vote of no confidence in your leadership." The timing couldn't have been worse. The company was still reeling from the recent upheaval, and a public fight could do even more damage to our reputation. But there was no avoiding it. If Dylan wanted a showdown, I was ready to give him one. The meeting was held in the company's main conference room, with stakeholders and board members packed shoulder to shoulder. Dylan and Brianna sat at one end of the table, their expressions smug, while I took my place at the other. Walter sat beside me, his presence a silent show of support. Dylan wasted no time launching into his pitch. "This company has been on a downward spiral ever since Alex took over," he said, his tone confident and commanding. "Contracts lost, client trust eroded, internal chaos. It's clear he's not fit to lead. We need new management, and I'm prepared to step in and restore stability." There were murmurs of agreement from a few stakeholders, and for a moment, I felt a pang of doubt. But then Clara signaled to me from the back of the room, and I knew it was time to counter. I stood, taking a deep breath to steady myself. "Dylan talks a big game," I began, my voice steady but firm. "But let's be clear. He's the reason we've lost contracts. He's the one who's been sabotaging our operations, spreading lies, and trying to buy his way into power. And I have the proof to back it up." I presented the evidence Clara and Marcus had gathered, the emails, financial records, and recordings that showed Dylan's involvement in the sabotage. As I spoke, the room grew quieter and quieter, the weight of the evidence sinking in. By the time I finished, even some of Dylan's allies were looking uneasy. Dylan tried to push back. "This is a smear campaign," he said, his voice rising. "Alex is just trying to cover up his own incompetence." But Walter chose that moment to speak up. "Enough," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "I've seen the damage you've caused, Dylan. You've betrayed this company and this family, and you have no place here." The final blow came when Grant stood and announced that he was withdrawing his support for Dylan's proposal. "I've seen enough," he said. "I'm backing Alex." The vote was swift and decisive. Dylan and his allies were defeated, their plans unraveling before their eyes. As the room emptied, Dylan shot me a final glare. "You think this is over?" he hissed. "You'll regret this." But I didn't care. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. The aftermath was bittersweet. Jordan, Cassidy, and Blake were gone, their betrayal cutting deeper than I cared to admit. But Walter and I worked together to stabilize the company, rebuilding trust with our employees and clients. Clara stayed on as a consultant, her sharp mind proving invaluable as we navigated the challenges ahead. One evening, as I was closing up the office, Clara stopped by my desk. "You did good, Alex," she said, a rare smile on her face. "Your grandfather would be proud." I smiled back, a weight lifting off my shoulders. "Thanks, Clara. I couldn't have done it without you." She hesitated, then added, "There's one more thing you should know. Dylan wasn't acting alone. Someone else was pulling strings behind the scenes." I frowned. "Who?" Clara handed me a folder. Inside was a photo of a man I didn't recognize, along with a series of cryptic emails. "He's been keeping a low profile, but I think he's the real mastermind behind this whole mess. You might have won the battle, Alex, but the war isn't over." As I stared at the photo, a chill ran down my spine. The fight for Walter's legacy wasn't finished, not yet. But this time, I'd be ready for whatever came next.